In 1827, a Virginia court made a ruling that still chills the blood today. In the case of Commonwealth v. Turner, the judges declared, "The crime of rape does not exist in this Commonwealth between a white man and a slave." Their reasoning: enslaved women were property, not persons, and property cannot be raped, only damaged. This was not a mistake, this was not an aberration, this was the first breath of a monster, a law that declared that black women's bodies existed solely for exploitation. But it began even earlier. In 1662, Virginia codified the principle of partus sequitur ventrum. The offspring follows the womb. Any child born to an enslaved woman would automatically become the property of her owner, regardless of who fathered that child. This single law transformed the womb of a black woman into a factory for human capital. It gave white men complete legal protection for sexual violence, while simultaneously rewarding them economically. The children born of these assaults became additional property, wealth that literally embodied their own violation. This was not a single crime, but a system, a machine of sexual exploitation that powered the engine of American slavery. Far from being isolated incidents of cruelty, sexual violence was deliberately designed as a cornerstone of slavery's architecture, economic, legal, and social. Thomas Jefferson himself calculated that a woman who brings a child every 2 years was more valuable than the most productive male field hand. Plantation records show enslaved women of breeding age commanded premiums of $200–300 above comparable male workers. Every act of violence against these women created profit. Every pregnancy resulting from rape represented increased wealth for the perpetrator. This is the story told through the whispers they dared to share, through the voices of Harriet Jacobs, who hid for 7 years in a crawl space rather than submit, through Elizabeth Keckley, who bore a child from years of exploitation and later became Mary Todd Lincoln's confidante, through the testimonies collected decades later, when elderly survivors finally had the chance to speak their truth, to understand how this machine worked, and the lives it ground up beneath it. Subscribe now. This is not just history, this is the foundation of wounds that still bleed today. To understand this machine of exploitation, we must first understand its architecture, the economic, legal, and social pillars designed to make sexual violence not just possible, but inevitable and profitable. The year 1808 marked a crucial turning point. When the federal government prohibited the international slave trade, enslaved women's bodies took on a new, terrifying value. No longer able to import human beings as property, plantation owners turned inward, creating what they euphemistically called natural increase. Enslaved women became walking investments, their reproductive capacity transformed into an economic engine. America's founding father Thomas Jefferson tracked the reproductive cycles of enslaved women with the same precision he applied to crop yields, noting pregnancies, births, and potential future value of children. His calculation that a woman who brings a child every 2 years was more valuable than the most productive male field hand wasn't an observation, it was a business model. His own relationship with Sally Hemings, who bore him 6 children while enslaved, embodied this economic logic. Edmund Ruffin, a Virginia planter who would later fire the first shot at Fort Sumter, kept meticulous calculations. His ledgers reveal that each enslaved woman could theoretically produce 10 children during her lifetime, with each child worth approximately $200 at birth. A single woman represented a potential profit of $2,000, a massive return on investment. This wasn't hidden, it was openly discussed, celebrated, and refined into business strategy. A typical advertisement from the 1858 Charleston Mercury reads, "For sale, a likely Negro wench, about 20 years old, with a young child. She is very prolific, having had 5 children, and is now pregnant with her 6th. She has been raised in a healthy climate, and is of good stock. Human beings described like livestock. Women's fertility marketed as a commodity. Children valued as future assets." But this ruthless economic engine required absolute legal protection. The courts provided a perfect shield, ensuring these financial incentives carried zero legal risk. Remember the logic: if an enslaved woman was property, then any child she bore was also property. This wasn't just a legal theory, it was the wiring of the entire machine. It meant that the children of rape became the legal property of the rapist. Meanwhile, any enslaved person who dared resist faced brutal punishment. Virginia's 1792 slave code mandated that if any Negro or other slave shall presume to strike any white person, shall receive on his or her bare back 39 lashes. The message was clear: submission to sexual violence was legally mandated. Resistance was criminal. The final pillar was social and ideological. The concept of absolute planter power became a cornerstone of Southern society. James Henry Hammond, a South Carolina planter and U.S. senator who maintained systematic sexual relationships with enslaved women and girls, wrote in his diary, "The master has the absolute right to the time, labor, and services of the slave, and to enforce obedience on the part of the slave in all respects." Even religion was weaponized. The Reverend Thornton Stringfellow's influential 1856 work, A Scriptural View of Slavery, declared that the right of holding slaves is clearly established in the Holy Scriptures, both by precept and example. This theological framework made resistance to sexual demands not merely disobedience to human authority, but rebellion against God himself. This was the blueprint, the machine designed to crush human dignity. Legal frameworks that protected rapists and punished victims, social ideologies that normalized violence as divine right. But blueprints tell only part of the story. To truly understand this system, we must listen to those who endured it and somehow survived. Harriet Jacobs published her story in 1861 under a pseudonym. Her words cut through more than 150 years to describe the methodical grooming of young enslaved girls for sexual exploitation. The slave girl is reared in an atmosphere of licentiousness and fear. The lash and the foul talk of her master and his sons are her teachers. When she is 14 or 15, her owner, or his sons, or the overseer, or perhaps all of them, begin to bribe her with presents. If these fail to accomplish their purpose, she is whipped or starved into submission to their will. Jacobs described how her master, Dr. James Norcom, whom she called Dr. Flint in her narrative, employed psychological warfare to break her resistance. He told me that he had seen me walking with a young man of my own complexion, and he would kill him if he ever caught me speaking to him again. He would tell me that I belonged to him, and would be his as long as I lived. This wasn't just about physical violation, it was about complete psychological domination, isolating victims from support while reinforcing their dependence on their abusers. Elizabeth Keckley would later rise to become Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker and confidante, but before that remarkable journey, she endured years of systematic sexual abuse. In her 1868 memoir, Behind the Scenes, she wrote with painful restraint, "I was regarded as fair-looking for one of my race, and for 4 years a white man, I spare the world his name, had base designs upon me. I do not care to dwell upon this subject, for it is one that is fraught with pain. Suffice it to say that he persecuted me for 4 years, and I became a mother." Decades later, in the 1930s, government workers recorded the testimonies of elderly, formerly enslaved people. Hannah Davidson of Virginia recalled the routine nature of sexual exploitation. Massa would come down to quarters, and if he see a nice-looking colored gal, he would just take her to his house for his cook or something, and then make her his mistress. Dart was common in dem days, and the wives knew it but couldn't help themselves. Against impossible odds, enslaved women developed strategies of survival and resistance. Some, like Jacobs, made strategic decisions to enter relationships with men of their choosing as protection against more brutal alternatives. "It seems less degrading to give oneself than to submit to compulsion," Jacobs wrote. "There is something akin to freedom in having a lover who has no control over you, except that which he gains by kindness and attachment." Others employed deception. Sarah Ashley of South Carolina recalled her mother's desperate tactics. "My mammy told me that when Massa come to her cabin, she would take all us chillun and hide in the woods till he leave. She say she rather take a beatin' than let him bother her. But sometimes he catch her and then she get both, de beatin' and de botherin'." Nancy Williams remembered her mother's different approach. "My mammy used to rub dirt and soot on her face and arms to make herself look ugly when the master come around looking for women. She say she rather look like the devil than have him botherin' her." For enslaved men, this system created a different kind of torture. The agony of being forced to witness the abuse of their loved ones while being powerless to intervene. Solomon Northup, whose narrative 12 Years a Slave documented his kidnapping and enslavement, described the nighttime summons that every enslaved person understood. It was common for the slaves to receive messages that they were wanted at the great house, and at all hours of the night they would have to go, and for what purpose I need not say. Henry Bibb described the particular hell of witnessing his wife's exploitation. "My wife was living in the same house with her master, and I could see him walking around the yard with her, and I knew what it meant. I could do nothing but grieve." Some plantations implemented systematic breeding programs that treated human beings like livestock. Charles Ball, enslaved in Maryland, described this dehumanizing practice. The master selected certain men and women and compelled them to cohabit together, whether they felt any attachment for each other or not, his only object being to raise as many young slaves as possible. Lewis Clark, who was enslaved in Kentucky, described how sexual humiliation was used to break men psychologically. They would strip a man stark naked and make him lie down on his face, and one man would hold his head and another would hold his feet, and then the overseer would lay on the lashes. Sometimes they would make him get on his all fours like a beast and whip him in that position. The system was designed to break them, to reduce human beings to property. But the voices we hear are not of broken people, they are of survivors. To understand how they resisted a machine designed to crush them, make sure you're subscribed. Perhaps no story better illustrates this will to survive than Harriet Jacobs' extraordinary decision to hide in a tiny crawl space above her grandmother's house for 7 years. The little shed had been added to my grandmother's house years ago. Some boards were laid across the joists at the top, and between these boards and the roof was a very small garret, never occupied by anything but rats and mice. The air was stifling, the darkness total. A bed had been spread on the floor. I could sleep quite comfortably on one side, but the slope was so sudden that I could not turn on my other side without hitting the roof. The heat of my den was intense, for nothing but thin shingles protected me from the scorching summer's sun. For 7 years she watched her children through a small hole, enduring physical agony rather than submit to sexual slavery. Enslaved communities developed sophisticated networks of protection and support. William Wells Brown described how women would band together. The slave women would take turns sleeping in the cabin of any young woman who was being bothered by the master or overseer. They would rotate so that she was never alone, and they would warn her when dangerous men were coming around. Some chose violent resistance, knowing it would cost them their lives. In 1855, a 19-year-old enslaved woman named Celia killed her master, Robert Newsom, after 5 years of relentless sexual abuse that had begun when she was just 14. She had already borne him 2 children. When he came to her cabin once night, despite her pleas, she fought back. She was executed for defending herself, but her act of resistance stands as testament to the length some would go to assert control over their own bodies. From Harriet's 7-year isolation to Celia's fatal defiance, each story was a human spirit straining against the machine's relentless gears, a machine that wasn't powered by cruelty alone, but by something far more cold and calculating: business. We've heard the testimonies, we've witnessed the suffering, now we must confront the most disturbing truth. This system of sexual terrorism wasn't driven by simple cruelty or lust, it was business. After 1808, when the international slave trade was outlawed, the entire economic foundation of Southern slavery shifted. Without new imports, the only way to increase the enslaved workforce was through reproduction, what slave owners euphemistically called natural increase. This created a domestic slave trade, where states like Virginia became breeder states, producing human beings for sale to the Deep South. Professional slave traders like Isaac Franklin and John Armfield dominated this market, combining business with personal sexual exploitation. Franklin's business correspondence reveals this disturbing blend. Writing in an 1834 letter, "I have 2 or 3 women that I think a great deal of. One in particular I would not like to sell." The slave auction became a ritualized display of this commodification. William Wells Brown, who escaped slavery to become a prominent abolitionist, described these events as a scene of lust and debauchery that would disgrace the most barbarous nation upon earth. Potential buyers examined women's bodies while openly discussing their suitability for both labor and reproductive capacity, what they called breeding. These advertisements leave nothing to the imagination. From the 1858 Charleston Mercury, "For sale, a likely Negro wench about 20 years old with a young child. She is very prolific, having had 5 children, and is now pregnant with her 6th. She has been raised in a healthy climate and is of good stock. Human beings described with the language of livestock breeding. A woman's value measured by her fertility. Her children past, present and future, valued as returns on investment. Every pregnancy resulting from rape represented increased wealth for the perpetrator. Every child born of violence became additional property. Every violation created capital. This wasn't aberrant behavior. It was the system working as designed." The testimony of Mary Boykin Chestnut, a white Southern plantation mistress, reveals the open secret of this exploitation. She wrote with bitter irony about the conspiracy of silence. "We live surrounded by prostitutes, yet an air of decency is preserved. This machine of exploitation, economic, legal and social, transformed sexual violence from individual crime into systematic business practice. It wasn't a side effect of slavery, it was foundational to slavery's operation in America. And like any machine designed for profit, it didn't simply disappear when slavery formally ended. It evolved, it adapted, its mechanisms continued working through new means, leaving wounds that still bleed today. Emancipation came in 1865. The law declared freedom. But what freedom exists in a body that has been systematically violated? What liberty can be found in the silent stares of children born of exploitation? The newly freed faced a society unwilling to acknowledge the specific sexual trauma endured under slavery. No trials were held for the systematic rape of generations of women. No reparations were paid for children born of violence. No psychological care existed for the deep wounds carried within. Frederick Douglass noted the cruel irony. When the slaves were freed, there was much said about giving them compensation for past services. There is a bill of another kind that ought to be presented for the outrage perpetrated upon the slave women of the South. That bill remains unpaid. That acknowledgement never came. Instead, the survivors carried their stories in whispered fragments, too painful to fully voice, too important to completely silence. Their children, some fathered by the very men who had owned their mothers, inherited this history, carrying its legacy in their blood and bones. For decades, this history was buried. Too shameful, we were told, too divisive, too complicated. Yet its echo resounded through the lives of millions, an unspoken inheritance passed from generation to generation. The system of sexual exploitation under slavery did not simply vanish with the 13th Amendment. It transformed, it adapted, and its legacy lives in our society today through stereotypes, cultural perceptions, and institutional biases. The Jezebel stereotype, the hypersexualized caricature of black women, created specifically to justify sexual violence, persists in modern media, affecting how black women are perceived, treated, and valued. A 2020 Georgetown law study found that black girls as young as 5 years old are still viewed as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, an echo of the dehumanization that justified abuse generations ago. The strong black woman trope, while seemingly positive, carries the toxic expectation that black women should endure suffering without complaint, just as their ancestors were expected to silently bear sexual abuse as part of their duty. Research on epigenetics now confirms what many have long understood. Trauma can alter gene expression in ways that pass through generations. The children of trauma survivors inherit not just stories but biological imprints of suffering. Studies of Holocaust survivors' descendants show measurable changes in stress hormones and anxiety responses. How much more might this apply to the descendants of those who endured centuries of systematic sexual terrorism? The economic aftermath remains equally stark. While white wealth could grow through generations built upon the forced reproduction of human capital, the children born of this exploitation began freedom with nothing, no compensation for their mother's suffering, no inheritance from their biological fathers. This economic chasm, born from slavery's sexual exploitation, has only widened. Today, the median white household has 8 times the wealth of the median black household, a disparity that cannot be understood without acknowledging its origins in the breeding system of American slavery. The physical health disparities we see today, black women facing maternal mortality rates 3 times higher than white women, connect directly to historical medical exploitation and the devaluation of black women's bodies that began on the auction block. Even our justice system carries the imprint of this history. A 2017 Georgetown study found that black women who defend themselves against domestic violence receive sentences 4.5 times longer than white women in similar circumstances, an echo of the brutal punishment Celia received for defending herself against exploitation. This isn't merely history, it is the architecture of our present. These are not coincidences but consequences, the aftershocks of a system designed to exploit black women's bodies for profit and power. The sexual exploitation of slavery was a business model, and because it is a story of profound shame, its truth has been buried. But we cannot understand our present until we confront our past. The testimonies we've shared aren't just historical artifacts. They are the foundation stones of systems that still stand today. When we listen to Harriet Jacobs, Elizabeth Keckley, and countless others whose names were never recorded, we hear not just echoes but urgent warnings about the world we've inherited. For more dark histories that explain the fractures in our world today, subscribe to Dark History Class and turn on notifications. Some truths are hard to hear, but they are essential to know. The first step toward healing any wound is acknowledging that it exists.